Proximal and distal. Why is a simple concept so confusing? Let's take a look at the Google definition using distal and proximal as prompt. The result may be, proximal means closer to the center of the body or the point of attachment. Why can this cause confusion? Well, this definition presents two concepts, center of the body and point of attachment, as equal alternatives when they are not the same. Not to mention that if you Google the same tomorrow, the definition may be, proximal means closer to the body's central point, trunk, or origin. So, center of the body, body's central point, point of attachment, trunk, and origin, are all the same? No, and center of the body and body's central point are too vague and not official anatomical references. The internationally accepted standard are trunk, point of attachment, and origin. You can also find the terms axial and appendicular, but when we talk about proximal and distal, we are comparing positions along a limb and their point of attachment, which is the shoulder or the hip. If we said proximal is closer to the axial region, it would be less precise, because the axial region is broader than the trunk. Let's put Google definitions aside for a moment and focus on the point of attachment instead. The rule is that every limb is anchored to the torso at a limb root. The upper limb root is attached to the shoulder joint or glenohumeral joint, and the lower limb root is attached to the hip joint. The point of attachment for the whole upper limb is the shoulder joint, and the point of attachment for the whole lower limb is the hip joint. That means when we use proximal or distal, we always measure distance from those limb roots, nothing else. So even the fingers are considered attached through the limb root at the shoulder. Let's imagine the limb is a chain. It's made of links, each one connected to the next. In the upper limb chain, the fingertip is connected to the finger bone, which connects to the knuckle, then to the hand, the wrist, the forearm, the elbow, the upper arm, the shoulder joint, and finally the trunk. This model allows us to find the relationship between any 2 points on the limb. Distal is a location that is farther from the limb root along the chain. Proximal is a location that is closer to the limb root. For any 2 points on a limb, start at the shoulder and move outward. The point you come to first is the proximal point. The point you come to later is the distal point. In anatomical positions, students often think that the attachment of the finger is the wrist, but anatomically, the path of the limb starts at the shoulder. The wrist is just another joint along the way. Don't think in the body as isolated parts. A correct mentality is seeing the limb as one continuous path or chain that originates at the shoulder. The hand, wrist, forearm, elbow, shoulder, they are all just points along that path. Let's see some examples. The fingers are distal to the elbow because they are farther down the upper limb starting from the shoulder. The ankle is distal to the knee because it is farther down the lower limb starting from the hip. Remember, in anatomy, the relationship between proximal and distal is always reciprocal. If one part is distal to another, the reverse is true. This is perfectly illustrated by the following pairs. The knee is proximal to the ankle, and conversely, the ankle is distal to the knee. The shoulder joint is proximal to the forearm, and in turn, the forearm is distal to the shoulder. The thigh is proximal to the shin, just as the shin is distal to the thigh. This same logic applies to all parts of the limbs. The hand is distal to the elbow. The thumb tip and knuckles are both distal to the wrist. The toes and heel are distal to the ankle and knee. So now, let's go back to where we started, that common confusing definition from Google and the textbooks. Let me read it again. Proximal means closer to the center of the body, or the point of attachment. And we asked, why the or? Which center? Attachment to what? Now, with your new understanding, this definition isn't wrong. It's just trying to cover 2 different scenarios in one sentence, and that's why it sounds ambiguous. Let's decode it. Scenario 1, the point of attachment. This is the primary and most precise use of proximal and distal. It refers to the point where a structure, like a limb, attaches to the main trunk of the body. For the arm, the point of attachment is the shoulder. For the leg, it's the hip. For a blood vessel in your leg, it's where that vessel branches off from a larger one. So the wrist is distal to the elbow because it is farther from the shoulder, which is the point of attachment. This is the usage we've been practicing. It's clear, consistent, and unambiguous. Scenario 2, the center of the body. With your new understanding, this definition isn't wrong. It's just confusing because it's using an informal term, center of the body instead of trunk, and that's why it sounds ambiguous. Therefore, while you could technically say the fingers are distal to the chest because they are farther from the trunk, this is confusing and not practical since the trunk is a large area, not a specific point. Does it mean close to your heart, your navel, the whole trunk? This vagueness is why we prefer the point of attachment for clear communication. Let's go back to another definition of proximal and distal from Google. Proximal means closer to the body's central point, trunk, or origin. But why do we say origin here instead of just point of attachment? That's because when talking about muscles, the origin is a more specific term. It is the point where the muscle attaches to a bone that stays mostly still during movement. To fully understand proximal and distal in muscles, we need to look at the concepts of muscle origin and insertion. The origin of a muscle is the point where it attaches to a bone that stays mostly still during movement. This point is usually more proximal. The insertion of a muscle is the point where it attaches to the bone that moves during an action. This point is usually more distal. The origin of the quadriceps is at the pelvis and femur, which is the proximal end of the muscle. The insertion of the quadriceps is at the tibia, which is the distal end of the muscle. The origin of the hamstrings is at the pelvis, which is the proximal end of the muscle. The insertion of the hamstrings is at the tibia and fibula, which is the distal end of the muscle. The origin of the deltoid is at the scapula, the shoulder blade, and the clavicle, which is the proximal end of the muscle. The insertion of the deltoid is at the humerus, which is the distal end of the muscle. The origin of the pectoralis major is at the sternum and ribs, which is the proximal end of the muscle. The insertion of the pectoralis major is at the humerus, which is the distal end of the muscle. The origin of the latissimus dorsi is at the vertebrae and pelvis, which is the proximal end of the muscle. The insertion of the latissimus dorsi is at the humerus, which is the distal end of the muscle. Here are some situations where the term origin should not be used. In nerves and blood vessels, you would not say a nerve has an origin. Instead, you say it originates from or branches from a specific structure. For example, the sciatic nerve originates from the sacral plexus. Ligaments. Ligaments connect bone to bone for stability. They don't contract, so they don't have an origin and insertion. You would describe their proximal and distal attachments instead. General anatomy. You wouldn't say the origin of the arm is at the shoulder. You would say the proximal end of the arm is at the shoulder. So remember, use the term origin when you're talking about muscles. Let's practice. The biceps brachii inserts on the radius. This insertion is what to the origin on the scapula? Distal. The insertion on the radius is distal to the origin on the scapula. The triceps brachii originates on the humerus and scapula. The attachment on the ulna is what to the origin? Distal. The ulna is farther from the shoulder, so it is distal. The quadriceps femoris inserts via the patella to the tibia. The origin at the pelvis and femur is what to the insertion? Proximal. Origins are closer to the trunk than insertions, so they are proximal. To understand proximal and distal, we first need to identify the reference point. Different structures use different reference points. Limbs and bones. The reference point is the attachment to the trunk. The shoulder is proximal, the hand is distal. Muscles, the reference point is the origin, the fixed attachment. For example, the biceps brachii originates on the scapula and inserts on the radius. The origin is proximal, and the insertion is distal. Blood vessels. The reference point is usually the heart. The portion closer to the heart is proximal, and the portion farther away, toward the fingers or toes, is distal. Nerves. The reference point is the central nervous system. Nerves that emerge from the spinal cord are considered proximal near the spinal cord and distal at their peripheral endings. The digestive tract. The tract forms a chain of organs: mouth, esophagus, stomach, intestines, and rectum. The point of reference is the mouth. It's the start of the chain. If we compare positions along this chain, then, the esophagus is proximal to the stomach because it's closer to the reference point, the mouth. The intestines are distal to the stomach because they are farther away from the reference point, the mouth. The stomach is distal to the esophagus, but proximal to the small intestine. The small intestine is distal to the stomach, but proximal to the large intestine. Finally, the rectum is the most distal structure in this chain, since it's the farthest from the mouth. The rule is always the same: proximal when is closer to the starting point of the chain, and distal when is farther away from the starting point. Notice a pattern? The key is, you always need to know from where you are measuring along the structure. In short, proximal and distal always describe position relative to a reference point. For this video, we'll stop here. Everything we've covered is formal anatomical terminology. Going further would take us into physiology, where the same terms are used in a functional context.